Can the US Treasury wake up tomorrow, revalue gold higher, have all the money deposited into their bank account, and then spend it however they want? The short answer to that question is no. The medium length answer to that question is yes, under certain circumstances. And the longer question is that it's both extremely simple and extremely complicated. But that is what we're going to talk about today. And the reason we're going to talk about that today is it's actually kind of bubbling up in the news again over the last, I think over the last several months and even over the last year. Secretary Bessent has written some pieces, before he was Treasury Secretary, and Trump has talked over time about the United States is not broke because everybody only focuses on the liability side of their balance sheet and never focus on the asset side of the balance sheet. And that the US, if they wanted to, could use the asset side of their balance sheet to make things a much different story. So that's kind of why we're going to talk about that today. But what really spurred me to talk about it was a conversation I had on, you guessed it, Twitter, where I often get into rather interesting, sometimes confrontational, and sometimes friendly conversations. But this was actually a conversation I really liked. And I think this is going to be a great episode because this is a really interesting, it's a really important topic, and it's one that's kind of timely. But as I said at the beginning, the answer to whether or not the Treasury can revalue gold and have the money deposited in their checking account and then go spend it however they want, it has a bit of truth to it, but it's also much more complicated than you might otherwise think. And they cannot do this on their own. They need help. So let me talk a little bit about why this is kind of coming up. And then we're going to go into why it's more appropriate now. And we're going to go into how it can become even more important and more topical in the future. Now, I think it's important to kind of step back and understand not only why it's coming up now, as I referenced Bessent's conversations or comments and Trump's comments, but it really plays into both Trump's and Bessent's overall strategy. And really, it's Trump's overall strategy, of which Bessent is one extremely important part. But as we've talked on this show many other times, and as I have written on Substack and in our overall Macro Alchemist piece, there's really a move away from siloed American strategies, whether it be monetary strategy or fiscal policy or trade policy or geopolitical policy. For a long time, each of these different functions had their own strategies, and sometimes they worked in concert and sometimes they didn't. But Trump has kind of come in and said, you know what? That's not going to happen anymore. And I think the guy that wrote about this best, and we've had him on here before, and we've featured him in our research, is Michael Every of Rabobank. And he wrote a piece called Grand Macro Strategy that I think very neatly summarizes this all. And it's essentially the unification of monetary policy, fiscal policy, trade policy, military policy, geopolitical policy. You are no longer going to have any one of these pieces unless it is putting America first. Now, as we've talked about before, it doesn't matter whether we like this. It doesn't matter whether we think this is the right way for the United States to project itself to the world. As an investor, you got to look at the world as it is and play the game as the board is laid out. And this is what Trump is going to do, whether we like it or not. He's putting America first in every different facet of America. And so it's really a unified strategy of all these different pieces. And the Treasury and the monetary and the fiscal, where it has been at cross purposes in the past, and it could still be at cross purposes now. And this is part of the reason why it's not so easy necessarily for the Treasury to do this. They want it to be streamlined into one policy, but there are still rules that are put in place that Trump has not yet changed that keep this in a situation where it could be challenging. So what I said at the beginning was the Treasury cannot on its own wake up, revalue gold higher, and then go spend the money as they want. That is absolutely true. But the reason there is some confusion or some conversations or even debate on this topic is so there is an element of truth to it. The Treasury can absolutely revalue gold. What they cannot do is then go spend that money all on their own, however they want, for two reasons. Number one, they need the Fed's help. The Fed is the government's banker. So going back to this unified strategy, as of right now, the government does not have a bank of its own. They have outsourced their banking function to a non-government entity. The Federal Reserve System is a government, quasi-government entity, but the individual Federal Reserve banks are not. They are privately organized and privately owned organizations. They are not government institutions. They are not government funded. The employees that work at the Federal Reserve are not federal employees. And there is legal precedent laying this out in very clear detail. Now, what's kind of interesting is the 7 members of the Federal Reserve Open Market Committee are federal employees, but the banks themselves and the workers at the banks themselves are not federal employees. So you start to get into a number of legal questions and some legal concerns that could keep this from happening as smooth as possible. Now, I did say it can be extremely simple. And it can be. So what I thought we would do is I'll walk you through how it can be extremely simple. And if everybody is getting along and if everybody agrees with the policy, there are already mechanics in place that this can work. And I should say the reason this came up now is, as I mentioned earlier on Twitter, it started off of, a conversation of whether the United States even has all the gold that they say they do. And there it kind of meandered a little bit. It ended up in, a discussion of MMT, and, Keith Weiner was involved and Luke Groman was in there. And they were talking about, well, does the U.S. currently do MT? Do they not do MMT? And then at one point, I can't remember exactly how it went, but something that went, the government can just print the money. And then, the government might decide not to print the money. The Fed might not play ball. And then another comment came back, well, if the Fed doesn't play ball, then the Treasury can just use gold to kind of get around the Fed and do this without their help. And so that's what kind of led to this discussion. And I should say, Luke Groman posted the mechanics via which this can work. And those mechanics that he posted are absolutely correct. And so I have no problem with the mechanics that were posted. A couple of days later, Jan Niehaus posted a report that explained how this can work. And I think I'd have no problem with that either. And I think they each referenced a piece by Mirmicon, who had referenced this maybe in an investor letter last year. And again, I have no issue with that either. There is a method via which this can happen. But to be clear, it can't be the Treasury all by themselves because the Treasury doesn't have a bank. They need help. And then the other thing is, even if they were able to do this and the Fed helps them and they deposit the money into their bank account, they can't just go spend it on whatever they want because Congress decides what the government's money gets spent on. So there's a number of moving factors in here and a number of different issues that get taken place just because the Treasury has the ability to write up gold doesn't necessarily mean they can put it in an account, start writing checks and buying whatever they want. The other thing is, I think to help put this in perspective and understand how this is going to work, I'll give you a little bit of history. So what happened back in I don't remember the exact date. I'm going to guess I think it was 1920 or 1929 1929, 1930. It was 1929 or 1930 when the U.S. said the private ownership of gold is no longer allowed. You have to turn in your gold certificates, et cetera, to the United States government. And the United States government paid everybody, I think it was $29 to do that. And or maybe it was $20. I can't remember what the exact number was. I think it was $20 actually. And then they took that gold and they gave the Federal Reserve gold certificates. And those gold certificates were priced at $35. So it was an automatic, huge windfall for the government because they paid $20 and now they're getting 35, right? Okay, and that difference gets deposited into the government's checking account, and then the Congress can appropriate that money, and then it can get spent. And then later on, I think it was in 1971, 72 timeframe, that $35 reference point was raised to 42. And that's where it currently sits today. So right now, the federal government's gold sits on the Treasury. The United States Treasury still owns the gold. They have the gold. They have not sold the gold. They have given the Federal Reserve gold certificates, and those gold certificates sit on the asset side of the Federal Reserve balance sheet. And so the corresponding liability is US dollar Federal Reserve notes in the TGA, but that was priced at $42. And so, and then that money can get appropriated and it could get spent by the United States government. So that's kind of the history of how that works. And so now why this is coming up now is, well, even though the government is holding, or actually not the government, it's the Fed. It's funny that's a key point. It's sitting at the Fed, which is not a government agency, or it's a quasi-government agency. But it's the Treasury's gold, and it's the Treasury's account, and it's sitting at $40. If they were to price that at today's market value of gold, which is $2,900, so quite a bit higher than $42, then that would equate to approximately $750 or $800 billion newfound Federal Reserve notes in the Treasury general account, which sits at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. So that is how, if the Treasury were to write up gold, and if the Fed were to accept those new gold certificates, and if they were to then credit the TGA, and then if and when Congress appropriated the spending of those funds, they could get spent. So it's not that there's not truth to this. It's just, but that's how it can happen. So let's walk through that very simple example of how this could happen again. And listen, I'm the first to admit that this is highly unlikely, but it's very possible that we could come walking in. The market's closed on Monday. Maybe we come in Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. and the Federal Reserve and the Treasury and the president have called a press conference, and they say, we have revalued gold on our balance sheet to $2,900 an ounce. And as a result, there is, $800 billion in the Treasury general account, update your spreadsheets. It's possible. You can't rule that out. There is functionality for that to happen. But again, you need all three of those, or at least two of those, in partnership cooperating to do that. So going back to this thread, this Twitter thread, the comment was that if the Treasury if the Federal Reserve is not playing ball and not providing the liquidity that the Treasury needs, then the Treasury can just sidestep the Fed and use the gold to do it. And this is my point is that that's not the case. They absolutely 100% need the Fed to be helping them. So then I know some people will say, well, of course the Fed's going to help them. Of course the Fed will do whatever they're told. To which I would say, are you sure? Because there's actually several times in history where the Fed has not done what the Treasury or the executive. So the Treasury is part of the executive branch. So the Treasury is not going to do anything that the president doesn't want them to do, because they answer, the Treasury employees answer to the president. And if you think that's the same thing for the Fed does not answer to the president. And the Fed believes that the president cannot fire them. And if there was any doubt about that, that question came up in one of the Fed conferences just over the last couple months. I think it came up in November or December, whichever one it was. And then again in this last one. And Powell was very clear that he believed that the president did not have the power to fire him. And the reason is because the government doesn't oversee the Federal Reserve. The government does oversee the Federal Reserve, but they are an independent institution. And so that's where it starts to get pretty interesting. So what if but the point is, we could come in on Tuesday, and they could have done this very simple mechanism where everybody's cooperating and it works. There's some problems with that, which we'll get into in a minute. But now let's go through some scenarios where it wouldn't work and why it wouldn't work. Why would the Fed not cooperate? Well, as I said before, there's several times throughout history where the Fed has not cooperated with the Treasury, or with the executive branch, I should say. And the reason is because the Fed has a dual mandate of full employment and stable prices, inflation, basically. And there's been times throughout history. Let me see if I can pull them up. I don't know if I have them right here, but I might even have them right here. I can just walk you through what they were. The first one that I can think of was in 1951. The government was spending a lot of money for the Korean War. And, the government wanted lower interest rates. And Truman wanted lower interest rates to fund the Korean War. And Fed chair was Thomas McCabe, later William McChesney Martin. They said no, because lowering interest rates would raise inflation. Now, this pissed off Truman, to put it very bluntly. He summoned them to the White House. They had a big meeting. He pressured them to cap interest rates. He even put out a press release saying they had agreed to do it. Well, it turns out they had not agreed to do it. So they put out their own press release saying that's a lie. We did not agree to do it. And so this erupted into a very public spat between the Fed and the Treasury and the White House. And so they even had this thing that was called the Fed Treasury Accord. And it ended the Fed's obligation to peg interest rates, and it solidified the Fed's independence, and that has held since then. Now, there's been other times, after Truman was not in there anymore, McChesney Martin was still in there. But let's go to the next war, Vietnam, and who was it? Lyndon Johnson. He wanted lower interest rates because he wanted to finance both the Vietnam War and he launched these great society programs. And so he summoned, the Fed chair to his ranch in Texas. And not only did he say, you're going to cap interest rates, he threw him up against the wall, put his finger in his chest and said, you are going to do this. He said, my boys are dying and you're going to help me save them, or you're going to help me spend more to win this war. And despite, Lyndon Johnson doing this, Martin still raised interest rates. He did not do it. And so the Fed won again. And so, these are the two examples I've given you where the Fed has done the exact opposite of what the president or what the Treasury wanted them to do. And so far, they're 2-0. Now, let's see. What's the next one? Richard Nixon and Arthur Burns. You're starting to get the picture here. Presidents always want low interest rates because they want the economy to be better. And the Fed, who is charged the dual mandate of full employment and low inflation or steady inflation, has to fight back occasionally. And the ironic thing here is I know there's many people out here thinking that the Fed is the one causing all this inflation. That's kind of an entirely different topic. And while there is some truth to it, these are examples where the Fed did not do what the president or what the executive branch wanted them to do because they didn't want to stoke inflation. And so the same thing happened with Nixon pressuring Burns. And that was Burns telling him, you have to lower interest rates. And there's even tapes. There's this on tapes, Nixon saying, we've got to get Burns to lower interest rates. The thing is that Burns actually ended up cutting. He ended up cutting rates. And so Nixon won that battle. So now it's 2-1, right? Okay, so 2-1. So the Fed doesn't always win, but they don't always just give in. So that gave way to Paul Volcker, right? And so remember, this is what was back during the inflation, when inflation was running a couple of years ago. What was the big rumor coming out of Washington? Powell doesn't want to be another Burns, right? That was said over and over and over again. He doesn't want to be another Burns. Well, Burns caved to the president. So if he didn't want to be Burns with dropping interest rates too much and letting inflation run wild 2 years ago or 3 years ago or 4 years ago, why does Powell all of a sudden want to cave to Trump now for the same thing? So let's go to the next one though, the fourth one. So now we're 2-1 with the Fed is ahead 2-1. So now we bring in Volcker, the legend, right? Now this is like bringing in, Johnny Unitas to win the game, because, nobody is more revered in central banking than Paul Volcker. This guy raised rates to 19%. I mean, and listen, he was like, I'm going to kill inflation. I don't care what you say. And do you think President Reagan, who had just gotten into office, wanted 19% interest rates? Of course not. And so, the Treasury Secretary's name was Reagan. So you had President Reagan and Donald Reagan, and they were trying to get interest rates lowered, and Volcker held them steady. And they even leaked rumors that they were going to replace Volcker, but Volcker didn't back down. He refused to change policy, and he ended up being right. Inflation came down. Reagan backed off. So now, and not only that, they reappointed him. Reagan reappointed him in I think it was it 82 or 83? So again, okay, so now it's 3-1. The Fed's won 3 times. The president's won once, right? Okay, so and then what? Okay, so what's the fifth one? Can we at least make this 3-2? Well, let's go something that I think everybody remembers a little bit more. Trump versus Powell. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that Trump had his first administration, right? So I think it was in 2000. Was it 18? 18 when Trump wanted lower interest rates, because now we're heading in. Yeah, because it was 2019, because now they're heading into 2020, and of course he wanted to have a good economy for getting reelected in his race against Biden. And so he wanted interest rates low. But what does Powell do? Powell raises rates. And not only that, but I believe Janet Yellen, when she was still Fed chair, she raised rates at the very end of 2016. I think it was either at the very end of 2015 or the very end of 2016. They didn't raise rates again until Powell does it in 2018 against Trump's wishes. And so how did Trump react to that? Did Trump say, hey, that's okay, you're independent, you do what you want? Of course not. What does Trump do? Trump comes out and calls Powell the enemy, like literally called him the enemy. So that's not exactly the executive branch and the Fed cooperating hand in hand, doing whatever the other one wants them to do. Trump even said, Powell is the biggest danger to the economy. Rather than helping it, he's hurting it. And Powell, I have to say, like, Powell kept his cool pretty well. He basically said the Fed was going to remain independent, and they don't play politics, and they don't get into it, and da da da. And listen, here's the thing. At the end of the day, the Fed is not independent. I think Fed independence is perhaps the greatest myth that is perpetuated by business schools today. But there is some truth to it, as I just pointed out. And so while ultimately the government could change the rules, change the laws, put incredible pressure, get him out of there, the point is Powell doesn't have to agree right away. He probably will. I mean, it would be quite a thing to not agree with and not accept the gold certificates. But it's not impossible that they wouldn't. Okay, so why would he not accept the new gold certificates at the higher price? What possible reason could Powell have for not doing that? Well, the reason is you have to understand what the different roles are. The Treasury has always been in charge of dollar policy. That has always been the case forever. But the Fed is in charge of monetary policy. So the government's in charge of fiscal policy, the Treasury's in charge of dollar policy, and the Fed is in charge of monetary policy. And their job is to keep stable prices and full employment. So why on earth would they now not like it if Trump and Bessent came in with a $2,900 gold price and a new $800 billion in the TGA? Well, because if you look back at these 4-1, so the Treasury, what was the Treasury 4-1 against the Fed was 4-1 against the executive branch. All of the times they stood up to the executive branch and didn't do what they wanted to do because they thought it would cause high levels of inflation, and they didn't want to do it. We are just coming out of one of the, other than the 1970s, the greatest inflation scare that people have in living memory. And I think in the last 100 years, other than the 70s, they haven't had anything like that, other than a couple occasions, very short periods of time during wartime. And so if all of a sudden $800 billion shows up in the TGA, that could stoke the fear of inflation reigniting rather than trending down to where they think it's going to go, right? The other thing is, can you think of anybody in history other than George Washington and the Roman general Cincinnatus? Can you remember anybody in history willingly giving away power and saying, yeah, just take it, no problem? No, of course not. The Fed doesn't want to give away their power, and their power is independence, and their power is setting monetary policy. When you start raising the price of gold, and that impacts the TGA, which then impacts inflation and full employment, that is now the executive branch getting involved in setting monetary policy. The Fed doesn't want any help setting monetary policy. They want to set it themselves. So while on the one hand, yes, they will probably, or they, work hand in hand, they don't have to. And there's many times, as I've just pointed out, that they have gone to battle. Another time, I didn't even address this one. I should address this one. What else happened over the last couple of years that could lead to an example of where the Treasury and the Fed did not exactly work hand in hand? Well, let's think about why was the Fed raising rates in the first place? They're trying to stamp out inflation. They're trying to put a stranglehold on the economy so that it doesn't run too hot and that we don't have more inflation. That's the whole point of raising rates. Well, what does Janet Yellen do during this time? Do you think she met with Powell and said, hey, I'm going to do everything I can to help you bring this economy to a halt and get inflation under control? No. This lady goes out and issues trillions of dollars of T-bills and spends down like a 1.5 trillion out of the TGA. So on the one hand, while Powell is doing everything he can, raising rates from 0 to 5% to get inflation under control, Yellen's over there like with a with a blowtorch. He's trying to throw cold water on the economy, trying to slow it down, and she's got a blowtorch over there, just setting everything on fire again by spending 1.5 out of the TGA and issuing T-bills like there's no tomorrow. So, the point is there are several examples of the Treasury not working hand in hand with the Fed. So on the one hand, this whole revaluation and topping up of the TGA is very simple. On the other hand, there's lots of complications. The Treasury can't do it alone. They need the Fed's help. And then ultimately they need the Congress to play ball as well. So can you imagine the Treasury comes to the Fed and says, hey, I think we're going to do this. Jerome's going to say, okay, but that doesn't exactly help us get inflation back under control. And they say, oh, come on, Jerome, just do it. And so then what if Jerome were to say, okay, we'll take your new certificates. That's the way it's written. That's the way the mechanics work. And then they go and they put an extra 800 million or 800 billion into the TGA, but it hasn't been spent yet because the government hasn't appropriated yet. What do you think is going to happen in Congress when they wake up and they find out that Trump has just revalued gold to $3,000 or $2,900? Do you think the Democrats and the deep state and the Main Street media is going to say, wow, that's a really smart idea. You know what? You finally won me over. I'm on board. Let's just do that. Hell no, they're not going to do that. They're going to say, this is the biggest constitutional crisis we have ever had in our life. This makes Doge look like a picnic, on a Sunday afternoon. There will be absolute outrage on the other side. It's not a simple thing to do. But let's just say that Powell goes along and says, okay, I'm going to do it anyway. Okay, so now all of them, this is extra money, but it hasn't been spent yet. But then Powell, because he wants to maintain his independence, he wants to maintain his power, he wants to maintain control over fiscal policy. Maybe he starts raising interest rates again rather than lowering them. And when the Treasury says, what the hell are you doing? He says, hey, you guys are in charge of dollar policy. I'm in charge of fiscal, or I'm in charge of monetary policy. And you guys just increased the monetary base. You increased the amount of money that can be spent in the economy. That I have to take that into account when I am, figuring out what I'm going to do from a monetary policy perspective. And that has the potential to reignite inflation. So I'm going to take rates from 4% back to 5%. Now, can you imagine what happens after that? I mean, so here's the point: is it can be extremely simple and work just like that. I absolutely agree. But it is also much more complicated than that. And, the other thing to remember is like the TGA, the Treasury General Account, that is the checking account for the Treasury. That does not sit in a government office. That sits in the New York Federal Reserve Bank. The New York Federal Reserve Bank is not a government institution. It is a private institution, and it is manned and employed by people who are not government employees. So again, how many times have we seen over the last couple of years where, especially with now that Trump is back in power, where government employees aren't necessarily following policy because they don't like Trump, right? Now, this isn't stuff I'm making up. There's been different, examples of this listed where, employees, were not doing what they wanted to do or what they were supposed to do. And because they thought Trump was a threat to national security or, breaking the law or whatever it was. So am I really, really way out on a limb to think that something as important as fiscal policy and monetary policy, that there might be an employee or a set of employees who wouldn't necessarily do exactly what the president wants to do, especially if their boss in Washington, D.C. is saying, don't do it? So again, I think this is an incredibly interesting topic. I think the fact that Luke posted these mechanics is a great thing, because I think a lot of people weren't aware that these existed. Jan, again, wrote a great piece. I would encourage people to read that. It does explain the mechanics of how the TGA can get refilled. But just so that we're clear, the Treasury cannot do this on their own. They cannot write themselves a check and then spend the money however they want. There is a process in place, and it's kind of like a separation of powers type thing. And it's probably for this very reason. Now, going back to the myth of the central bank being independent, I do think that's a myth. Ultimately, Jerome can be replaced. They can get the rules rewritten. And it would not shock me at all, for this very reason that we're talking about now, that at some point in the future, that's what happens. The Fed gets rolled up into the Treasury so that they don't have these hassles. They don't have the possibility of this happening. We get back into this unified grand theory where everything is working towards the same goal. But that doesn't change the fact that there are complications right now. The other thing that we haven't even talked about is what happens in the market. Let's say that they do this. Let's say that Trump decides he wants to revalue gold at 3,000. They get the extra 800 billion. The Fed says, yeah, it's great. No, we don't worry about inflation anymore. The Democrats say, yeah, it's fine. We love Trump. Let's just do it. Okay, we do that. So now, what happens if gold goes from 3,000 to 2,400? I know people don't like it, the fact that they've bought a bunch of bonds and then the price of the bonds fell. They've said that that means that the Fed's balance sheet is upside down. Well, what if the same thing happens with gold? Or let's take the other way. They do this and they say it's $3,000. that's probably going to spur a lot of people to, get interested in gold. Maybe people go buy gold. Maybe gold goes to 6,000. Maybe it goes to 10,000. Okay, so then it goes to 10,000, right? And they top up the TGA even more. Now you've really got a lot of money in the TGA. What do you think, Powell's going to do under those circumstances when gold's at 10,000? Or again, what if it does go to 10,000, but then for whatever reason, it goes back to 7,000? Now they're underwater again, right? And so the Fed balance sheet all of a sudden is jumping all over the place. Or once they do this, do they decide to peg the price of gold? Okay, so then how do you peg the price of gold? Well, you can't just wake up and say, okay, gold is $10,000. Gold's $20,000. If you do say that, you have to stand willing to buy it at that price. That's what a peg is. Okay, so then what does that mean? That means that the Fed or the Treasury or whoever in the government decides to do it now has to start bidding for gold at $20,000. Well, where does that money come from to bid gold at $20,000? Well, they either have to borrow more of it or they have to print more of it. So you start to get into this vicious cycle of back and forth of how do you peg the gold price? And then if it's pegged, do you let people redeem it at that price? So the point is there, while on the one hand, this is extremely simple and it could happen just like that, it is extremely complicated. We haven't even got into what happens to the market participants who own gold ETFs, who own gold on the COMEX, who have commercial shorts on the COMEX, who have naked shorts on the COMEX, who have derivative exposures through various over-the-counter instruments all over the world. You start adding those. How do you solve all that stuff? Does everybody get stopped out for cash on a Friday night before the revaluation? Probably. But then what does that do for market confidence when it reopens the next week? Are people going to trust the other COMEX contracts? Are they going to trust the other derivatives contracts? The point is, this is a very complicated topic. It's super interesting. I'm glad that I was part of this conversation to start talking about this because it is very interesting. But to be absolutely clear, without the Fed to monetize the gold, the Treasury would have to sell it. Now, with the Fed cooperating, they don't have to sell it. But without a cooperating bank, and the government's bank is the Fed, they would need to sell it to get cash for it. The Fed is not going to sell their gold. The Fed is not going to get rid of their gold. And if the United States owes gold to some other country, that other country is not going to get it. That's just not going to happen. Listen, nothing is impossible, but it's very unlikely. And if another government says, hey, I want my gold back, my guess is that the response from Trump would be the same. What's the Greek saying? Is it molon abe or something like that? Come and get it. I mean, possession is 9/10 of the law, right? Again, I think, and this kind of goes back to the grand unified theory. Trump is no longer really playing by the rules-based order. I've written about this a lot on my Substack, and I would encourage people to go to Substack who are interested in this topic. I will also write up this conversation that I'm giving today. I will write this up on a Substack to see all the different angles and the important factors. Listen, I think this is an incredibly important, incredibly interesting topic. But we are kind of moving into a period of time where the rules-based order is changing. This is not the United States ceding hegemony. This is the United States saying, we're the biggest boy on the block and we're going to act like it. Now, I don't necessarily like this. I wouldn't necessarily prescribe this remedy, but this is what we're getting. And this is the world we're living in. And I think we need to be ready for it. So that's kind of why this topic is important. It wouldn't shock me at all if at some point down the road, gold were to get remonetized in some form. But I wouldn't expect there to just be peace, love, and kumbaya when it happens. And there's a lot of different factors to think about when it does. So I'm going to leave it at that for now. I think I've talked about twice as long as I thought I was going to. But listen, I hope this starts or continues the conversation. The conversation's already going on. I hope it continues it. It's pretty interesting, and we'll see where it goes from here. Anyway, hope everybody has a great weekend. Again, check out the Substack if you want to learn more about it. It's santiagocapital.substack.com. And hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and all that kind of stuff. And we'll talk to you again next week. Peace.